Hey everyone, I'm Steve from GamersNexus.net, and this is our Fallout 4 volumetric lighting benchmark and explanation of volumetric lighting in Fallout 4. When benchmarking Fallout 4 on our lineup of GPUs, we noticed that the R9 390X was outclassed by the GTX 970 at 1080p with ultra settings. This has certainly happened before in some very specific games, but it's rare, and it caught us by surprise that given the 390X's comparatively high raw horsepower, the performance differential was still about 5% at 1080p, favoring the GTX 970, which theoretically should perform a little bit lower in frame rate than the 390X. So this gap is reversed a little bit when moving to higher resolutions like 1440p. We see the 390X actually pull ahead, and that reversal makes sense because the 390X should be objectively superior at 1440p than the 970. It's just capable of handling more pixels. But the advantage 970 at 1080p required more research to fully appreciate, so that's what we're here to do today. These findings spurred on a day's worth of research of settings, and that unveiled a few settings that heavily impact FPS, but we were never able to produce any particular favor toward one manufacturer or another by changing these. It generally kept the same delta, just with a higher FPS output by lowering settings. Shadow distance is a really good example of this. We saw FPS swings of about 16.7%, which translated to around 20 FPS on the 970 and the 390X, when lowering shadow distance to medium from ultra. But even with these changes, the 970 still outperformed the 390X at 1080p, and that was worth investigating further. So we eventually discovered that console commands can be used to toggle levels of volumetric lighting and God rays in the game, which seem to impact FPS fairly heavily. And you can do this by using the tilde button and then do GR and on or off, or you can just type GR and look at all the options. You can set detail levels and debugs and things like that as well. Fallout uses NVidia's volumetric lighting effects and God rays, something that immediately sort of threw a red flag as a benchmarking item for us. So, for the unfamiliar, volumetric lighting is named such because it appears to sort of creep through the air, and it interacts with other volumetric effects like smoke and fog and clouds. And in games with volumetric particle effects, this is another big visual gain to have the volumetric lighting interaction as well. In Fallout 4, volumetric lighting is primarily comprised of God rays, which are basically just shafts of light that shine down from the sun or other very bright sources of light. And we decided to run benchmarks and see if the 390X can outpace the 970 at 1080 and take a lead when God rays are disabled on both devices. Before we get to those results, though, let's get back into some basic information on how God rays work and talk about the way the beams are actually displayed in the game and translated through the engine and things like that. So God rays cast beams of light that also interact with reflective surface materials and shadows and generally create the apparent depth that is given in some of these objects. And what you're looking at right now is a debug tool built into Fallout 4. And the tool shows us the presence of God rays using two different modes. Wireframe, which creates red and green wires indicating strike points and light pathing, and then God rays only, which turns off all other light sources and shows only the illumination created by God rays. The latter, the God rays only mode, is extremely useful in understanding exactly why God rays are volumetric in this game, and shows that even when an object isn't directly in the line of a beam of light, it will still receive light from illumination shed by that beam, hence volumetric. And actors in the vicinity, actors being NPCs in this game, in the vicinity of reflective materials will receive some of the light from God rays as well. So because volumetric light can bounce and proliferate when interacting with certain surfaces, you'll see that passersby, those types of people in the general area will receive light from the reflectivity and the bounce and things of that nature. We talk about this in more depth in our GDC 2015 interview with Crytek, who explained physically based rendering to us. We talk about Star Citizen, things like that. So do check that interview out. Go to the channel and just search for physically based rendering. You'll find it, or Crytek probably. And With NVIDIA's implementation of volumetric lighting, everything is done using tessellation, or the process of effectively doubling the triangles on the graphics hardware for increased apparent detail. So tessellation, that's what it does. It ultimately doubles triangles, it increases triangle count, and creates more apparent detail. That word apparent is very important because it's really just an appearance thing. It looks like more detail, but in the game, the polys, it's still the same poly count. It's not increasing the poly count in walls or faces or anything like that. This apparent detail increase allows for more displacement and smoothing of surfaces, something we talked about with Epic Games in an interview. Search the channel for tessellation for that. And tessellation also creates the appearance of higher resolution surfaces, which means you'll see more bumps and divots, and generally higher fidelity and apparent depth. With volumetric lighting through NVIDIA's Fallout 4 implementation, which uses GameWorks, the lighting is fed through tessellation processing instead of post-processing effects, which will sort of hammer the GPU clock and eat more cycles. So there's a valid reason to move to tessellation, especially because tessellated lighting gives the advantage of allowing light shafts and effects and illumination to still show even when the source of light is obfuscated by some object in the game or something like that. Tessellated lighting lends itself to cooperation with occlusion and is exactly why you can see the light pouring over the edges of a surface area, or a surface rather, even when that surface is physically blocked for the light source. So if you're looking at the sun and you sort of walk around a building, that building ends up blocking the sun, but you can still see the sun's rays being cast around the edges of the building, like the roof or something. That is a result of using tessellation. NVIDIA, as it happens, is really good with tessellation, and they know this, and they built their architecture around optimizing for tessellation in games. Look at The Witcher 3 with Hairworks. That's all tessellation. And AMD struggles with it. So, again, look at The Witcher 3 with Hairworks. AMD is not great with tessellation. They're good at a lot of things. They're good at different things than NVIDIA. Each company has its advantages from its architecture. They've taken different approaches philosophically to their architecture, but the use of tessellated lighting does mean that AMD will struggle a bit in this regard, in Fallout at least. So we tested that stuff. First off, note that our original bench course took place during a nighttime playthrough around 11 p.m. in-game, and that created the best mix of GPU workload for FPS testing. This new test for volumetric lighting strictly was conducted during the game's daytime to get the most exposure to God rays. Here's a look at the charts showing tessellation impact on the 390X and the 970. Obviously, the FPS results will be different than the previous test because it was conducted at a different time of day, different weather, things like that. The 390X still trails the 970 at 1080p even when both devices disable God rays, and that's probably an optimization issue or drivers or something with the game. But we still see a measurable performance gain for each device by toggling God rays, and the 390X has the biggest gain of the two. It moves from 71 FPS to 80 FPS average, and increases its 0.1% bottom line considerably to 44 from 36 by disabling God rays. The average FPS gain calculated is about 12%, and the 970's average FPS gain is about 7%. It moves from 81 to 87 FPS. So the gap shrinks, but the 970 still retains its lead. At 1440, the 390X still runs just ahead of the 970 thanks to the 390X's advantage in the additional pixel workload processing department. The 970 kind of gets bogged down by all those extra pixels. And the gap is, of course, shown still when you toggle God rays. So if you need some extra performance, that's a good way to do it. What we found, though, ultimately, is that even disabling many of the volumetric lighting effects will not inherently grant AMD a performance advantage. It fixes a lot. The performance advantage for AMD is a larger delta than for NVIDIA in general because of the way the optimization works, but the gap is still there. It's not eliminated. This is a good way of improving your performance of about 12% or so on something like a 390X. So if you do need a quick gain for performance, then I would suggest playing with God rays, but it does take away a lot from the game's environment because the game isn't particularly impressive in the textures and modeling department anyway. So Make your changes wisely. Shadow, distance, and God rays are the places I would start. The gap is still present for AMD and NVIDIA, even with volumetric lighting off. And if you like this kind of content, check out our Patreon page to help us out, help us make more of this, or just hit the channel and watch the other stuff, because that's the biggest way you can support us, is by watching more things or reading things on the website. That's all for this time. I will see you all next time.